I'm Alex Rondinan and welcome to If History is Any Guide, the political, historical and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. Today, we're going to be talking about the upcoming same-sex marriage postal plebiscite. What is going to be happening over these next couple of months? What does this all mean for the 13-year-long campaign for marriage equality? And why is that washed-up loser and creepy old man Tony Abbott suddenly in the national spotlight again? Let's find out. This upcoming postal plebiscite on the question of changing the existing marriage laws to allow for marriage between same-sex couples is shaping up to be the most important event in Australian politics in a very long time. Perhaps since the 2007 election, perhaps since the Republic referendum in 1999, perhaps since the Mabo decision in 1992. For the marriage equality campaign, this is well and truly crunch time, when it's time to pull out all reserved money, manpower and social capital to contribute towards winning this fight. 13 years of hard work and sacrifice have culminated into this moment, this very brief and very intense couple of months, when the entire national conversation and public arena will be focused fully and solely on this topic. If the Yes campaign is able to score a large victory, perhaps a 2/3 majority, it will create massive political pressure on federal parliament to pass the legislation to legalise same-sex marriage once and for all. But if the majority of polled Australians vote no, then the campaign will be stalled and held back for years, and somewhat disappear from the national eyeline. Here are the key dates to keep in mind. The cut-off date for voter registry is August 24, which means that Australians must register to vote or update their details with the Australian Electoral Commission by that date in order to get their ballot paper and participate in the survey. The ABS will begin mailing out ballot papers on September 12, and responses have to be mailed back within 2 months by November 7. And the result will be publicly announced on November 15. If there's a large yes majority, then there's still time in the year for a private member's bill to be introduced and voted on in the parliament. So hypothetically, we could have same-sex marriage by the end of the year. The first thing to point out about this postal plebiscite is that it's basically just a long, large, very expensive survey. The result is non-binding, which means that it has no constitutional or legislative consequences. It's being carried out not by the Australian Electoral Commission, but by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Very awkwardly and confusingly, the list of all registered voters who will receive ballot papers will be provided to the ABS from the AEC. There will be no public funding of the campaigning. No one from either camp will get $1 from the federal government, which means that all materials will need to be provided and paid for through private donations. And, most frustratingly of all, politicians in Canberra are under no obligation to act in any way, in either framing legislation or voting on bills, with regards to the survey's result. Which means that in terms of concrete legal obligations and duties, this postal plebiscite is utterly meaningless and useless. So there's a good chance that over the next 3 to 4 months, the Yes campaign will have a large and thrilling and inspiring victory. But those members of Parliament who oppose same-sex marriage will simply not budge and keep with their opposition, intransigence and obstruction on the issue, meaning that legislation will be in no better a situation to pass at the end of 2017 than it was at the start. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be forgotten that national politics isn't insulated from what happens in the rest of the country. Political capital and moral pressure are very mysterious and very dangerous creatures, and one underestimates their power at one's own peril. Whatever the result of this plebiscite, even if it's non-binding and legally non-functioning, there will be significant political consequences to be wrought and costs to be paid for those politicians in Canberra. Whoever wins this vote will gain the political upper hand and be in prime position to force through their desires come November and December. History can provide us with insight into this reality. There has only ever been one previous occasion in Australia's history where we've had a referendum-like plebiscite. It was during World War I, when the government wanted to introduce conscription. And even though it already had the constitutional power to legislate it immediately, it didn't have the political capital or mandate to do such. So it held a plebiscite on this question. A majority of Australians voted no, and even though it was non-binding, the legislation for conscription was never passed, and the Prime Minister Billy Hughes was forced to resign in shame. There's no reason to suggest why this couldn't happen again. If there's a significant victory for the Yes campaign, say a 2/3 or 3/4 majority, then that could be enough to overwhelm the situation, to force the legislation right through Parliament and into law. In 2004, when John Howard and the Liberals instituted the original ban on same-sex marriage, a plurality of Australians were in favour of such a measure, 44% to only 37% against. By mid-2007, just before Howard lost the election to Rudd's Labor, a majority of Australians now supported the legalisation of same-sex marriage, 57% to 37% against. In the 10 years since then, poll after poll has demonstrated that there is a significant, sometimes overwhelming majority of the population in favour of marriage equality. In percentage terms, it has mostly been in the 60s, with the lowest mark being 57 and the highest 76%. Meanwhile, over this same period of time, opposition to same-sex marriage has remained around the 20s, with the lowest being 21 and the highest being 31%. In all this time, no poll made by an independent body and based upon a reasonably broad and mixed representation of the Australian population has ever shown the two camps to be anywhere near each other, let alone a majority in opposition to marriage equality. The closest that anyone has gotten to the two sides being at parity was the ABC's Vote Compass, which ran a poll and excluded everyone who was somewhat in favour of or against marriage equality, so that the only people counted were those strongly one way or the other. These are people who will never switch to vote for the other side and are so passionate about the question that they will do whatever it takes to properly cast their vote, rain or shine. In that poll, it was 44% saying yes for same-sex marriage and 25% saying no. There is a major gender difference on the question, with women overwhelmingly in favour of marriage equality, 65% to 25%, while men are much more evenly split, 47% to 40%. In terms of age, the younger the age group you are a part of, the more likely you are to be in support of marriage equality. 18 to 34-year-olds are 68% in favour, while the 35 to 54-year-olds are 58%, and the over 55s are 41%. Within broader Australian society and its positioning on the postal plebiscite question of marriage equality, we have seen a very obvious, very acrimonious left versus right divide with regards to the two campaigns. All of the organisations and movements of the left, including the Labor Party, the Greens, the ACTU and the trade unions, Get Up, etc., have all pledged to contribute money, muscle and man-hours to the Yes campaign. The moderate section of the Liberal Party, which includes the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, is also officially in favour of same-sex marriage and has been urging Australians to vote yes in the ballot, but hasn't as yet committed to contributing to the campaign in any way. Turnbull himself has already publicly declared that he will not be participating whatsoever in the campaign. The major organisation that is leading and building the no vote is the Australian Christian Lobby, a small but wealthy lobby group that uses conservative religious rhetoric to justify its position, who have for many years been very infamous in their old-fashioned homophobia and religious fundamentalism. Alongside the ACL, the No campaign is being backed and managed and funded by the forces of the political right, including the Conservatives from the Liberal Party, led by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, as well as the Nationals and One Nation and the other smaller right-wing parties. Some commentators and journalists have speculated that for the No campaign, considering the dire state of the polls, the fact that only a quarter of Australians oppose same-sex marriage, of all the possible ways that a public poll could be taken on the issue, the only possible way that they could ever win would be through this kind of a non-compulsory postal plebiscite, because it weakens the ground for the marriage equality campaign and plays into the no vote's strengths. It's no surprise then that in Canberra it was the Conservatives who moved in favour of the postal plebiscite, as opposed to the moderates in the Liberal Party who were more in favour of an open vote on the floor of the House or a compulsory plebiscite. Firstly, because it's not mandatory to vote, millions of Australians who don't feel strongly or urgently either way on the issue will simply choose to not bother marking their ballot paper, leaving their home and finding the nearest mailbox in order to cast their vote. The agnostic centre majority, who when pressed have tended towards being sympathetic to same-sex marriage, though not passionately so, will be removed from the vote count. Secondly, doing a postal plebiscite might confuse and alienate a large number of younger people who aren't familiar with the Australia Post, or the procedure of mailing a letter, meaning that they will find it difficult to properly have their opinions heard within this survey, and which will give older, more conservative, more postal familiar voters an overrepresentation in the final count. So, let's go through these two concerns one by one and see whether or not they are actually weighted in favour of the no vote, as all the commentators seem to believe. First, the vote is just a survey rather than a plebiscite or a referendum, which means that it's non-compulsory and thus will have a far lower turnout. But wait, wouldn't making the vote voluntary be of benefit to the Yes campaign? Because they have a lead already in the general population, and this would be exaggerated when the postal ballot is recorded. Most of the polls show a split 60 to 65 in favour of marriage equality and 20 to 25 against it, with the other 10 to 20% being undecided, don't know and don't care. That middle ground won't be motivated enough to bother voting one way or the other, so the only people who will vote in this survey will be those who have a strong enough opinion on the question that it drives them to properly cast their vote, even if it's voluntary for them to do so. If that undecided remainder is removed, then the percentage of the population in favour of and against marriage equality will be increased as a relative percentage. Those voting no will go from being in the mid-20s to the low 30s, while those voting yes will go from the mid-60s to the low 70s. So the margin of victory for the Yes campaign will actually be higher than what it would be otherwise if the uncommitted Australians were compelled to vote and were included in the total count. And secondly, the fact that younger people will be disproportionately excluded from the vote due to their unfamiliarity with the postal service. To be honest, most of this talk, which comes from commentators in the mainstream media, is just patronising and belittling towards young people. Even if they don't have any first-hand experience with the post, they have access to the internet and older family members, which can provide them with all the relevant information they need. Because this plebiscite and the issue of the illegality of same-sex marriage will remain in the mainstream media and the public eye throughout the course of the campaign, it's highly unlikely that anyone will be left unaware of the cut-off time or just forget to vote by the date. And since young people who are in favour of marriage equality are so for very strong and determined reasons, it's hardly likely they're going to pass up this vote out of disinterest or laziness. They'd be willing to do it under no matter what circumstances, and it's just a matter of figuring out how by looking it up. So, in conclusion, when you shed away the old and ridiculous stereotypes about millennials and actually try to predict voting intentions based on concrete evidence and reasonable expectations, there's no reason to imagine that young people ought to be overly underrepresented in the final ballot. At the time of this being recorded, there is less than a week to go before the cutoff time for people to enroll to vote or update their details. Because this is a postal vote and the ballot papers will be mailed out to all voters, this means that the issue of making sure that one's registered address with the AEC is up to date, because otherwise you will not receive your ballot paper and thus be unable to vote. Campaigning has only just begun. The first op-eds are being published in the newspapers. The money and resources are being pulled together. The ad hoc campaign committees are being organised. The posters, leaflets and memes are still getting designed. The High Court challenge against the government's legal ability to even hold this postal plebiscite has not yet been heard, let alone a decision made. So we are still in very early days. It's likely going to be a long 10 weeks, with hundreds of hours of work ahead of us, countless conversations and debates with random people off the street on the issue, with many controversies or crises to occur along the way. The journey has only just begun, and there's no telling what things will look like in 10 weeks, in mid-November, when the ABS releases the final results of this postal survey. And that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to If History is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Alex Rondinan. Until next time, goodbye.